communities down here for research, and and also there's just a lot of people who are very excited and invested in their history and in archaeology in general. So there's been a lot of people who've already started to come and they're interested in getting involved with in archaeological projects with me in southeastern Arkansas. So it's a really exciting time for me. Um, what I'm going to do tonight is I'm just going to review. There's going to be kind of two halves to my talk. I'm just going to spend the first half talking about my past research experiences, so you can kind of see what I've been doing, and then the second half will just be me kind of introducing some of the ideas that I have for projects in southeastern Arkansas, so that you can get a taste of that as well. And then there will be time after that to ask questions, or if you have comments, uh, you can speak up after I give the talk. So my first experience, well, not my first experience with archaeology, but my first time sort of running my own project was when I was an undergraduate at University of South Florida in Tampa. I participated in some digs with the Florida Public Archaeology Network in Ybor City. And for those who aren't aware, and probably aren't aware being here in Arkansas, Ybor City is an historic cigar manufacturing town that was established in the 1880s. And now it's part of Tampa. But it was basically set up by some of the cigar manufacturers as, cities for the workers to come in and work in the factories. And it sort of saw its high point in the early 20th century. And then following the First World War, um, there started to be, the owners started to introduce mechanization, and there was this move away from the skilled laborers who were hand rolling cigars, and it was a very illustrious position to have actually in the cigar industry. And what I did was, so for those who don't know, there's these things called Sanborn fire insurance maps in the late 19th century and in the early 20th century. The Sanborn Company, uh, you know, throughout those decades, created several of these maps in order to make their insurance policies. And so they're maps of city blocks that have very, very detailed information about the sizes of structures, the materials the structures are made of, what the structures were used for, what types of roofs they had, and it's very, very specific and well done maps. And what I was able to do, because of how specific they are, I was able to take the maps and bring them into GIS software, that's Geographic Information System software. And I was able to basically reference them to county data, so that way I could measure the buildings. And because they're so precise, I was able to line up the maps of the historical maps with the actual lines today of where the streets are and where the blocks are and that sort of thing. So I was able to basically go in here, and there's an image of here of some of the blocks that I was doing in Ybor City, and I selected 18 blocks of houses, of cigar worker houses, and I was able to bring it into the software and then use tools to measure the square meters of each building and each house. And then once I had that data in hand, Ybor City also had very good city directories. And the directories not only listed people by their last name, but there was also street directories. So I could go down each of these streets with the address from the map, and it would have listed the head of household and their occupation. So I was able to get data listed on, how much living space the cigar maker families occupied during any given year. And there were 3 or 4 different years that I had maps that lined up with directories. So I was able to show over time, how living spaces changed for cigar workers in Ybor City. And this kind of lined up with some of the political changes that were going on amongst the workers as well. So that became my honors thesis as an undergraduate anthropology student, and I was able to actually get this published in the Florida Anthropologist Journal. Uh, and I also did some digs there. Like, none of the artifacts from the digs were involved in my particular research project. There's also a photo here of my kids. This is 10 years ago now, so they're a lot bigger now. They're teenagers, but they also came out and did some of the digging with us. So that was really fun. So it was mentioned that for my master's thesis, I developed this project where I was investigating the archaeology of homelessness. And at the time, Tampa was really on the news because of homelessness. There was a bunch of legislation that was passed in Tampa that basically made it illegal to be homeless. Um, the police were able to use certain laws to be able to take homeless people and put them in jail for using public spaces. And there was sort of this emerging literature at the time where there were archaeologists, or at least at the time one archaeologist, who was visiting homeless camps and looking at the material culture. And I found this very interesting. So what I did was I went to there's this small area north and east of the city of Tampa limits that's just outside the actual city limits, but it's still in the same county. And this is where a lot of the homeless people go because it's county territory, and so they weren't being harassed by the city. And so my project had kind of two elements to it. I did this archaeological component where I was visiting campsites and I was documenting material culture on the campsites in the same way that an archaeologist would document material culture at an historical site. And one of the interesting things that came out of it that I, emphasized was, you know, I think it's there's a certain stigma to homelessness that homeless people are, alcoholics or drug addicts. And what I found at all the campsites was that there was, I mean, in the first place, I didn't find any drug paraphernalia at all, not even one item, but also alcohol containers when compared to other types of food and beverage containers were a very small number. And in fact, if one was to analyze anybody's trash, whether they live in a house or not, it was a similar amount of alcohol type containers. So looking at the material culture is a way to sort of destigmatize homelessness in a way. But then I also had this second set of data and the second approach that I took to it called participant mapping. And this is really where the cultural anthropology comes in. I went and interviewed homeless individuals in this area, but instead of doing a traditional interview, which, as you can imagine, there's hundreds, if not thousands, of projects where people interview homeless people. I did what's called participant mapping, and so you might be able to see there's a map here on the screen. I took copies of this map, not with the symbols on it, just a blank map. And then I had homeless individuals mark on the map where they went for certain activities. So they would mark where they went for food, where they went for, uh, getting clothing, where they went to socialize, which most people wouldn't think about when it comes to homeless people. And I was able to come up with this map where I marked down where certain activity areas were for homeless people. Because obviously these are places that were made and intended for certain types of activities, but the homeless had sort of taken over them and used them for their own activities. And um, this was an important project because I was able to take this data to aid groups in Tampa who were trying to bring food and clothing and health care to homeless people in this area. So I was able to show them, here's where you go, here's these activity areas. And so I was able to meet with nursing students and other types of advocates for the homeless who could use this type of data. And I'm not sure that any other kind of work like this has been done yet, but it was sort of a pilot for this type of a project that could be done in other cities on a larger scale with a larger organization or staff. After I finished my master's, as was said earlier, I went to work at the Florida Museum of Natural History, and one of the major projects that I was involved with during my 5 years there was developing this comparative mission archaeology portal. And for those who aren't aware, um, in northeastern Florida is the city of St. Augustine, which is one of the oldest Spanish cities in the Western Hemisphere, and there were several Spanish missions throughout northern Florida and also just throughout the southeast, but especially in northern Florida during the 1600s. And many of these, mission sites had been excavated in the 1970s, 1960s, even the 1950s. And so I was part of this project where we not only rehabilitated these collections and reanalyzed them. I mean, some of them had never really been analyzed in the first place, but rehabilitating the collections and then building a research database that is publicly accessible online for researchers and anybody who's interested in mission history to be able to come and look at the data and use it for their research. And what we did was we worked with this group called DAACS, DAACS, which stands for the Digital Archaeological Archive of Comparative Slavery. And they're very well known for having this database, a similar research public database on sites connected to slavery, and especially African American plantation sites. And it's not just sites in North America. There's sites from all different parts of the globe that have to do with slavery. And they've kind of developed sort of the standard for making this kind of public research archaeology database. So we worked with them. They came and gave us training in their system, and we used their system to develop this Spanish mission portal. So I worked on that for several years, and it was a very good experience because I got experience, analyzing different types of artifacts, especially what archaeologists would call historical artifacts, or post-European contact with Native Americans artifacts, and that really became a lot of what my research was for my PhD dissertation. I didn't, however, work with the Spanish mission project for my dissertation. Instead, I got connected up with the Chickasaw Nation, which was again mentioned earlier. The Chickasaw Nation is very invested in their history and also in archaeology. They have a whole division of archaeologists, and they're located in Oklahoma today. They were one of the groups that was removed during the 1830s from their ancestral homelands in the southeastern United States. But they hire and employ an archaeological staff in Mississippi, which is where they were located just prior to removal. At one time, the Chickasaws were located on a very large section of Tennessee as well as Mississippi. But I became involved with some projects with the Chickasaw Nation in Mississippi. And the Chickasaws have a program called the Chickasaw Explorers. And what this is they send out usually college-age students, a group of between 15 and 20 students, to Mississippi during the summers for 2 or 3 weeks. And they get to not only visit their ancestral sites and get a tour of the area, but they also come and work with us as professional archaeologists, and they get to dig on the sites that are related to their heritage. And they get to learn about archaeological methods. We get to interact with them and find out what is important to them and what they think about our work. And so it's this big collaborative effort. And I really enjoyed my experience working with them. So I decided to develop my own project with them, which was this Charity Hall project. And Charity Hall was an 1820s boarding school for Chickasaw children that was in the Chickasaw Nation in Mississippi at the time. There was legislation passed by the U.S. Congress in 1819. It's now called popularly the Civilization Fund Act of 1819, and they designated money to be given to Protestant missionaries to establish missions among the Native American peoples, especially in the Southeast, but all over what was then the United States in 1819. And there were actually 4 or 5 different schools within the Chickasaw Nation, and there were a dozen or more schools also in the Choctaw Nation, which was just to the south of the Chickasaw Nation. Actually, I have a map here where I put some pins. It's probably hard to see, especially if you're on a phone, but there were several missions in the area, and the mission that I investigated was run by the Cumberland Presbyterian Church. And the schools at this time were very different than the schools in the late 19th century, which is what most people think of when they think of Indian boarding schools. These are missionaries who were invited in by the Indians, and the Indians actually helped fund the schools. And the children were taught the normal reading and writing and math and that sort of thing, but also a large part of the education and the civilization, so to speak, was teaching agricultural methods and to the boys in particular, and how to work with domesticated animals. And then the girls had female teachers who taught them how to sew and how to, keep a house. And because historically, and before Europeans started to make their way into these territories, it was traditional for men to be hunting more often, and women often in charge of the agriculture. And so the Europeans were really coming in and saying, well, if you want to be civilized, you have to farm like us, you have to live like us, you have to eat like us, you have to dress like us. And so a lot of what the school was bringing this sort of practice into the Native American life ways. So there's been some historical research done on these schools in the 1820s. And as you might be aware, most of the Indians were removed from the southeastern US beginning in 1830. So many of these schools only were there for 10 years. It's a very short time period that these schools were in existence. And there's been, as I said, some historical investigations, but very little archaeology. In fact, before I put a shovel in the ground at Charity Hall, there was only one other school that had ever been excavated archaeologically, and it was in North Carolina. So what I argued was that it's fine to do historical research, and it's very important. And in fact, I did archival research for my dissertation, but you can't really understand how European Americans civilized Native American people without looking at the material culture and looking at how they live on a day-to-day basis materially. And really the only way to get at everyday life, or one of the best ways, is through looking at materials and material culture. Uh, so, in some of the documents, there's discussion of, regimented routines. They were woken every morning with a trumpet, and they were, given a specific routine every day. And there's documentation in some of the letters written by the Reverend who operated Charity Hall that some of the kids didn't enjoy that very much. They were used to coming and going as they pleased, being able to move about their landscape as they pleased, and so being required to be in a specific place at a specific time on a daily or weekly basis uh, was not fun for some of the kids. And so they had some that stayed and some that didn't stay. Um, I found that dining was really the center, in my opinion, of the whole civilization practice. Um, I found some faunal or animal bone materials related to food, and all the faunal that materials that we found were from domesticated animals, from cows, from sheep, from pigs. There were no what we call wild game animals, such as deer and other things that people would have hunted. And this really shows that not only were the kids being kept in a certain place and being given an education, but they were being told how they should eat and what they should eat, which I don't know about you, but food is at the center of a lot of our activities, a lot of our lives, and our social circumstances are based a lot around where and how and with whom and what we eat. So they were eating specific types of food, and then of course they were also using European and also I found Chinese porcelain dishes and ceramics and uh, food containers. These were all items that, while of course the Native Americans had access to for some time, it was a different kind of a situation where the children were being surrounded and inundated by this material culture every day, all the time. Uh, and then, of course, there was also the clothing. A lot of the discussion in the historical documents was about clothing and being able to procure appropriate clothing for the kids. They didn't like them to wear their traditional clothing. And then language as well. The English language was very important. And in fact, I've read a lot of letters from the missionaries that they actually preferred to send the kids away and have them stay with English speaking families on their own, because then they wouldn't be around their friends who would speak in the native tongues. And so it was better, in their opinion, to have them go off and be isolated among English speaking people. And that was actually done by some of the schools during the 1820s. What's also interesting, as I said earlier, the Indians, at least in the case of the Choctaws and the Chickasaws, they invited the missionaries in, and in fact, they were very big supporters of the school. And many of these Indian leaders, especially in these groups, were also mixed, not only Chickasaw and Choctaw, but also British American as well. Many of these had already, accepted Christianity and were very favorable towards certain churches. Levi Colbert, who's pictured here on the left, was the person who allowed Charity Hall to be built on his own personal property 2 miles from his house. And he considered himself a member of the Cumberland Presbyterian Church. So a lot of these missions had sort of patrons within the Indian groups as well who oversaw them. Here's some of the materials that I found. It's just a small sample. There's a couple of buttons at the top, which are clothing items. There's a glass button, which is interesting because it's more of a high, a high priced, expensive item. Many buttons at the time would have been bone buttons, but we did find a couple of glass buttons, and then also some of these copper stamped buttons. I found hand painted Chinese porcelain, as you can see on the left. And this was found in what I think was the dining hall. It wasn't in the personal collection of the missionary. It was probably used collectively by the students. And so that's potentially evidence of them being taught how to dine at a table and have proper dining etiquette. There's some accounts in the historical letters that Father Bell, the Reverend, would sit at the head of the table and they'd have the girls on one side and the boys on the other side. But that's really all that's in the historical documents about it. So looking at some of these items can show, how they were actually civilizing the kids using European and also these Chinese objects. In the middle, there's some slate artifacts. This would have been used for writing tablets and also for pencils. Um, they wouldn't have had very well. Some places had paper, but they would also use these slate writing tablets and either slate pencils or even chalk to do their exercises and their writing. And then I also found this coarse earthenware marble. It was probably made locally, but it's evidence that they at least had time to play. It's evidence of a toy that I found at the site, which is interesting. And those were commonly made at the time too. Um, I talked about English already, and so I kind of in my dissertation, I connected this to sort of like the larger picture of what was going on in the 1820s and with the United States as a growing power. And it was increasingly in competition with Great Britain and with France and with other European powers on a world stage. And really, the US government was driven to sort of at first try to civilize the Indians. That way they could, have better control of the North American continent, but then eventually remove them once that was no longer viable and too costly for them. So really, this was one of the early instances of what one would call American colonialism or American imperialism, being exhibited toward other entities. And just some interesting things. I did some comparisons with contemporary houses at the time. I had a good uh, you know data set from a Cherokee homestead in North Carolina that was from the same time period, just to compare and see how they were different. And what I found was that in a lot of these contemporary Indian houses that were not missions, they had much higher numbers of what we would call traditional ceramics. They had, and in fact, the Cherokee example is interesting because they actually had really good access to blue and white European ceramics. They were very cheap at the time. They could have gone to the store and gotten them very cheaply, but there were very few. There was very little evidence of those kinds of ceramics at these houses. They were still using a lot of the more traditional coarse earthenware ceramics. So that kind of shows how there was differences between the schools and these houses. Let's see how I am for time. Okay, I'm going a little longer than I wanted to. So I'll move into. I've already there's a lot to do in southeastern Arkansas. There's a lot of opportunities for research. I've actually been telling colleagues here at UAM how excited I am to do research, and they're a little bit surprised. But maybe it's just because I'm an archaeologist and there's evidence of people everywhere for a long time. There's been people here for thousands of years, and so there's a lot to do and a lot of fun stuff to do, I think. Um, One of the first things I'm interested in is I've had some experiences looking at DeSoto related sites across the Southeast. Um, Probably if you're in Arkansas and you're interested in archaeology, you know that DeSoto spent time in Arkansas and he died in Arkansas. And but and archaeologists really like to connect actual archaeological sites to the historical accounts of the DeSoto expedition. And that's because even though they are very biased and written from a certain point of view, they do give descriptions of native peoples at that time. And so if one can connect the sites to that, then you can connect the material culture to these written descriptions. And I've been a part of some projects where we've had some success at locating Spanish artifacts on what we call Mississippian period sites, during the 1500s. There's a site in eastern Mississippi that I've done work on where we found hundreds of Spanish metal artifacts. And then also this summer, and this is a picture of me this summer. Actually, I was involved in a project in Alabama. We were looking for the location of Mabila, and on this particular site, this one day we found like 25 artifacts in one day just through metal detecting of Spanish metal artifacts. And what's interesting, the object in my hand is part of a horseshoe, and the horseshoe has been worked like a stone tool. And what the Spanish would do is they came and they brought gifts for the Native American peoples to, curry favor with them. And they brought these metal chisels. I didn't put a picture of the chisel in here. And this is research that hasn't been published yet too, so I don't want to get too far into it. But they would bring these metal chisels and give them out as gifts, and then the natives would work them like stone tools. And we found many chisels that had been worked, found horseshoes that had been worked. And a lot of people just don't know how to find metal artifacts, or they don't know that they're Spanish metal. In fact, at this particular site, this site had been excavated in the 80s, in the 1980s, test units, and all the metal artifacts we found were around the test units. There were none in the spot where the test units were dug. So it seems as if the people excavating just didn't know that it was Spanish metal and they were discarding it, because it looks, for somebody who doesn't know, it just looks like some junky, recent historical metal. But in fact, there's people who have expertise in the Spanish artifacts and they can identify them. So I'm interested, finally, in doing research like this in southeastern Arkansas. Guachoya is the city where Desoto apparently died, and based on some of the recreations of the route, that it could be in northeastern Deshay County, which is in the UAM station territory. And the Pine Bluff Station Assistant Bob Scott has kind of shared some information with me about some contenders for Guachoya or for other sites at the tail end of the DeSoto expedition that have never been investigated with metal detection. So I'd like to visit some of those sites and see if we can find Spanish artifacts. I'm also interested in developing, and this has been done a lot in southeastern Arkansas already by my predecessor, Jody Barnes. I'm interested in further developing some of the plantation archaeology. The picture here is of the Taylor House. It's an older picture. If you go there now, it's much nicer. They've done a really good job at the Taylor House. There's several plantations in southeastern Mississippi, especially in that delta area next to the Mississippi River. From what I'm told by one of my history colleagues here, many of them were owned. They were all owned by a small group of people from Kentucky, and they all knew each other. And so there's some interesting research questions, I think, to ask about how similar or different the plantations were. From what I can tell, at least for the Hollywood plantation, which is where the Taylor House is, and the Lakeport plantation, nobody's really definitively located where the slave cabins were. And that's something that I'm interested in doing. And that's something that can be done through metal detecting. And I've had success at finding contemporary sites with slave cabins through metal detecting. So I'm interested in visiting some of these sites. And in fact, I'm going to Taylor House tomorrow. I'm going to try my luck with a metal detector. And I'm also going to do some stuff at Lakeport, I think, as well. But also, just through my research, I found about this Sunnyside plantation, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with. In fact, some of you might be on the call because I made an appeal on one of the local Facebook groups about the Sunnyside plantation. It was originally a plantation that was contemporaneous with Hollywood and Lakeport, but later on in the 1890s, it was used as a place for Italian immigrants to come and set up farmsteads. And there's still a very active Italian community in this area who, from what I can tell, are very very avidly interested in their history, and they are interested in archaeology and in history. And so I'm very excited to meet many of those folks and to see if we can develop some archaeological projects related to the Sunnyside plantation, because so far, from what I can tell, there aren't, there's a sign, as you can see here, but I don't think there's been much archaeological work done in connection with Sunnyside. And so I'd like to be able to find some material evidence to supplement and enhance a lot of what historical knowledge is already existing. And just as a footnote here, I'm interested with the plantations. I mentioned earlier about DAX, the digital slavery archive. I'm interested in taking some of these collections of artifacts that are connected with the plantations and getting the DAX program connected to them and getting them analyzed. That way they can be part of this public research database, and that way they can be part of the whole system of plantation related sites across the globe. I'm also interested in, this has been done somewhat by the local society chapter. The Tunican chapter is mapping and documenting African American cemeteries. There's still, from the time of emancipation, there's still large groups of African Americans in southeastern Arkansas, and some of these cemeteries have been documented already by my predecessor. There needs to be more done, and then I've also found that there's emerging databases online and websites online that would like to showcase African American cemeteries specifically. And actually, what I find interesting is that on some of these stones, you probably can't see it on the slide, which is fine, but they have symbols from fraternal organizations that many of the African Americans after emancipation were members of, and they would help fund these tombstones and pay for them. And one of my history colleagues here at UAM is actually doing some historical research on some of these societies that African Americans developed following the American Civil War. So I'm interested in documenting some more of these cemeteries and getting them cleaned up, and making connections with the local communities there, because having this type of a material existence on the landscape, I think, can help enhance the history of African Americans in that part of the state. And then this is probably obvious if you're familiar with the survey at all. It's very much a public archaeology platform that engages with the community through programs and educational opportunities. And I'm very interested in doing educational programming all over southeastern Arkansas. I've already lined up talks actually for the local Rotary Club here and some of the Friends of the Library. And I've gone to two different county historical society meetings so far, and I'm trying to get involved with them. Obviously, we have the Tunican chapter here, which is getting itself back on its feet after the COVID pandemic. And then also, I specifically want to go out to high schools, especially in Deshay and Chico County, which is, I looked at some of the statistics, and there's some issues there with high school graduation rates and that sort of thing. And the university here at UAM is very passionate about recruiting students and encouraging people to get a college education. And so I'm interested in taking archaeological programs into those high schools and using that to help the students become more engaged with high school first of all, and then also for those who are interested in it and pursuing a higher education degree as well. I think even if they don't want to do archaeology, ultimately it's still a good way to get people focused and engaged and onto something positive. So that's really um, what I'd like to do here. And there's obviously much more I could say, but in the interest of time, I'm going to stop there. And I want to say thank you to the Arkansas Archaeological Society for inviting me to talk. And I'm excited that so many people came to see what I had to say. And I'm very, very excited at the all the opportunities that are here in southeastern Arkansas for research and for programs and community. And it's going to be really fun, I think. So thank you very much.